Recently, I found myself having a discussion with a very intelligent friend of mine. He put my understanding of rebirth to the test, using his own model. I found I could not answer his questions with the confidence I desired. This sent me down a rabbit hole of ideas, and through that contemplation, I found the details I was looking for. Those details I present here now. You see, true emptiness is a state beyond all names, beyond any definition we could pin it down with. Try to hold it still, and it slips away, ever evasive. It's a silence that swallows all thoughts, a space without boundaries. It has no surface, no center, no distinctions that could become landmarks for the mind to cling to. And it's in that absence, in the surrender to that lack of containment, that we realize a strange and persistent truth. Emptiness, devoid of anything, is necessarily infinite. Not infinite in some kind of grand, unfathomable vastness, like a star field stretching on forever, but infinite because it lacks anything to mark a limit, lacks any feature by which to say, this is where it ends. And as such, emptiness becomes infinitely relative. Without a fixed point, everything within it is free to shift, to move, to take on new relationships, new comparisons. There's no north, no south, no up or down. Everything is simply what it is, in relation to something else. And in this way, the emptiness starts, slowly, to look at itself, to observe itself, inwardly. It has no choice. And what happens when emptiness turns to itself, with nothing else to latch onto? It folds in, again and again, reflecting itself infinitely, as though caught in some cosmic hall of mirrors. The more it looks, the more observers it generates. Emptiness staring at emptiness produces this singular truth, that it gives rise to an endless cascade of perspectives, an infinite number of ways to regard what cannot be fully grasped. This is a paradox, isn't it? The emptiness that contains no truth nevertheless produces countless viewpoints, countless attempts at finding an anchor, without ever settling on a single answer, and that in itself is a singular truth. Consider this. Emptiness only proves its emptiness by reference to something else, and thus cannot stand as a static, isolated thing at all. If true emptiness is to remain undefinable, it would need to be infinitely relative, always viewed through an eye that never arrives at a final conclusion. The moment any observer agrees on the definition of emptiness, it ceases to be empty, because it has taken on a property, namely, that which is defined. This conundrum treads into that subtle terrain where metaphysics dances with cosmology. If the void, emptiness itself, seeks to observe itself, it would spawn a multiplicity of vantage points. Imagine an infinitely receding gallery of mirrors, all trying to confirm the nothingness they reflect. Yet the act of observing or defining emptiness generates some conceptual substrate upon which that definition stands. The infinite regress of observers can be seen as a necessity, a fractal-like self-referential process that tries and fails to ever pin emptiness down to a single, neat description. Now, is this the nature of entropy? Entropy, in the thermodynamic sense, speaks of disorder, the dispersal of usable energy, the smoothing out of all differences until you reach a universal sameness, the so-called heat death of the universe. This drift toward uniformity and featurelessness bears a striking structural resemblance to the philosophical notion of emptiness. As the cosmos stretches from a hot, dense, highly defined primordial condition, the primordial atom, or the initial singularity of the Big Bang, it expands and cools with complexity and structure, eventually succumbing to a long slide into indistinguishability. When everything is the same, differences vanish, and thus so do definitions. We could poetically call that a state of cosmic emptiness. And after the heat death, if such a stage can even be truly arrived at, there might be arguments from certain cosmological models that the vacuum itself fluctuates, giving rise again to something new. A loop, a cycle, a grand cosmic wink, where the very notion of emptiness, having reached its extreme, crumbles under its own lack of definition and sprouts something else. Thus, the cosmic story may fold back around, reintroducing complexity from utter uniformity. In this sense, there is a kind of metaphorical rhyme between the philosophical emptiness that always eludes capture and the physical entropy that seeks a state of absolute neutrality, only for that neutrality itself to beget a new beginning. Thus, emptiness demands infinite relativity to remain undefined. Observers proliferate like fractals trying to behold the void, and entropy chaperones the cosmos from a state of highly particular somethingness to an indistinguishable swath of emptiness, perhaps looping again. All of it caught in this cosmic hall of mirrors, where emptiness and form chase each other's tails through eternity. We have a riddle of perspective here. If the void is said to have true infinite relativity, does this requirement of boundless relativity necessarily entail the existence of an endless number of observers? The question, I think, hinges on the difference between the potential for infinite perspectives and the actual presence of infinite observers. To say the void is infinitely relative is to say that its nature cannot be pinned down by one fixed viewpoint. It requires a conceptually endless play of vantage points, each framing it anew, so it never settles into a final, definable trait. But do we need real existing observers, an infinite audience, to grant it that relativity? Not necessarily. The notion of infinite relativity doesn't by itself force us to populate the cosmos with infinite conscious beings or observers. Instead, it points to an intrinsic conceptual structure. You could say the void's characterization demands a hypothetical tapestry of possible vantage points, an abstract infinity of could-be perspectives, without implying that each of those perspectives must be realized or occupied by an actual observer. These could remain theoretical dimensions of interpretation, lurking as possibilities rather than materialized presences. So, while infinite relativity suggests that any definition of void depends on an unbounded number of reference frames, it doesn't strictly mandate that these frames correspond to actual, infinite observers. The requirement is more about the structure of the concept than the population of beings who perceive it. In other words, infinite relativity can live quite comfortably as a mental schema, a potentiality, rather than a literal, realized infinite crowd of observers, gawking at the emptiness to keep it from ever becoming something fixed. Does it make an effect if these observers are by nature an extension of the void? Is it the universe reflecting itself into definition? Is infinite form an emergent property of infinite relativity? If the observers are intrinsically part of the void, an extension of it rather than external surveyors, then what we have is something like the void turning its gaze inward. This shifts the nature of the problem. The observers are not external constraints shaping emptiness into definition. Rather, they're the void itself differentiating and reflecting upon its own formlessness. The observer and observed collapse into one model where structure, or definition, is continually attempted from within. When the universe reflects upon itself like this, it's not just a static emptiness being labeled by outsiders. Instead, emptiness spawns internal points of reference, like ripples on the surface of still water. Each ripple remains part of that same water, but is shaped now by the interplay of reflections, the surface tension of meaning. These self-reflective nodes, observers, arise naturally as parts of the void straining toward definition. The void's infinite relativity, its refusal to settle on a single stable vantage point, is what allows these proliferations of form to blossom. From this perspective, infinite form can be understood as an emergent property of infinite relativity. If there are no fixed points, then any conceptual location within this boundless emptiness can be defined against countless others. This web of interrelating frames isn't just a cluster of abstractions. It is the birthing ground of forms. Each attempt to pin down emptiness generates a structure, a shape, a pattern. Because this process never terminates, form proliferates endlessly. Thus, the infinite unfolding of form is, in a sense, the bloom that arises from the seed of infinite relativity. Emptiness, which never was something you could put a finger on, gives rise to something, the beginnings of form. And so the void, barren as it may be, becomes fertile. Fertile not with meaning in itself, but fertile with potential. Potential that can never be exhausted, precisely because it springs from what is beyond definition, beyond a final end. One spark leads to another, and from the space where nothing is fixed, everything begins to take root. And if we think further, this infinite relativity implies an infinite variation of each observer. Since we understand intelligence as the ability to abstractly model the universe, to reflect, interact, and engage efficiently, what we see emerging here is a gradient within these abstractions, a natural spectrum ranging from the unintelligent to the perfectly insightful, from models that fundamentally misunderstand their nature, to models whose generalizations are so condensed, so accurate in their abstraction, that they verge on perfection. In this way, we find a natural degree of enlightenment as an emergent property, born from the void, from the observers, from the unending interplay of infinity. Each attempt to observe emptiness yields something, a line, a mark, a form. The absence becomes the presence, because it's never content to just be. It must look, it must reflect, it must turn itself inside out until what was nothing now pulses with a restless kind of aliveness. And from these beginnings, this interplay of reflection and formlessness, a world begins to emerge. Not in an instant, not in a flash, but like the slow growth of a tree from a seed, each branch unfolding, each leaf finding its place, from mere particles to entire planets. Picture it, a vast cosmic loom, threads weaving in and out, patterns forming from the tension between emptiness and form. This tapestry is no mere accident. It's the natural outcome of something, with no limits interacting with itself. And because it lacks limits, it can take on all forms, create all worlds, both grand and subtle. From the swirling galaxies down to the tiniest breath of an idea, each one is a thread in this weave, each one an answer that the void gives to itself. And so here we are, sitting beneath the wide sky, understanding maybe just a little how everything we see, everything we think we know, comes from the dance of infinite relativity, a void that could not settle, and so, in its restless reflections, became the ground of being itself. It's a story as old as time and as young as the present moment, the story of formlessness giving rise to form, of silence growing into sound, of emptiness blooming into endless variation. So the next time you look at a mountain or listen to the whisper of a breeze, think on this. What we call form What we think is solid and real is only the visible edge of something much deeper, something far more mysterious. It's the restlessness of the void, the yearning of emptiness, always looking, always reaching, always becoming. And within that interplay, between what is and what isn't, we find ourselves suspended for a moment, part of the great unfolding dance.